Welcome to today's podcast. My name is Pearlie Brewer, and I will be your host. Today's podcast guest is Haley Flaro, Executive Director at Ability New Brunswick. Welcome, Haley.
Thank you, Pearlie. Nice to see you.
Last fall, there were a number of articles written about customers with disabilities experiences while traveling with Air Canada. Those stories made me wonder if we've really made any progress in this area. So today we've invited Haley to talk to us about the challenges that people with disabilities face here in New Brunswick in 2025. So let's start with you, Haley. Perhaps you could tell our listeners a little bit about your role with Abilities New Brunswick.
Thank you, Pearlie. I'm celebrating, I think it's this month, my 19th year anniversary with Ability New Brunswick. We work with people with a mobility disability. Our youngest service participant, that's what we call our clients, how we refer to our clients, is a little 2-year-old with cerebral palsy, learning to walk using a rollator. And our most senior is 106, a senior that wants to stay living in her own home as safely as she can, as long as possible. And so she accesses our Seniors Navigator services.
So that's a little bit about your clientele. I said that it kind of makes me wonder when I read these stories about if we are making progress. But, I think in all fairness, maybe we need to start off by let's talk about the positive and the progress we have made. The good things, what are the good things that you see when you look around New Brunswick that we can start with by discussing?
Well, I do have a unique lens because my mother lived a long life with a mobility condition. So since a young age, I've always seen the world a little different. I notice when a curb cut is not cut in a way that has an accessible path, or if a power door opener isn't working. But you talked about the positives. Certainly, I just turned 50 in the last year. Certainly, since my childhood, I've seen a lot of improvements with respect to community accessibility. There have been a lot of improvements. We see more accessible playgrounds that are safer and obviously more inclusive to children. I see a lot of changes to public spaces to make them more accessible. Our human rights legislation has advanced significantly, acknowledging, that disability and ability and access and inclusion are human rights. We've certainly also seen the development of rehabilitation programs for workers, for those experiencing disability, workers, like I mentioned, injured workers, that have helped people, reclaim, adjust to their disability, look at assistive technology, make significant gains in their health. So we've seen rehabilitation programs really expand throughout the country to help people do things such as return to work, live independent lives, adjust to their life with a new condition or a new disability.
So looking at the negative, what are you seeing that concerns you and maybe does make you wonder if we are making the necessary progress or we could be moving faster? What are some of the things, for example, when you're out around town, you live here in Fredericton, and what kind of things do you see that you say, hey, we should be doing better than this?
Well, it's a timely podcast because my phone and my email is burning up this month. We're a provincial organization, so we hear from people throughout the province. We have had a relatively mild winter, not very much snow, but the last 2 weeks have been really difficult. And, a lack of accessibility due to inadequate snow removal is a huge issue for our population. It creates unsafe sidewalks, lack of snow clearance, it creates unsafe crosswalks. It can eliminate the ability to access a bus stop safely or get on a bus. And so those are some of the things that we're hearing from our service participants regularly. It's quite isolating. Not only is it unsafe, we have stories every week of individuals helping, push people using a mobility device out of a snowbank. It creates safety issues, but it also really leads to isolation when you can't get safely around your community. So snow removal in winter times, I carry a shovel in my vehicle because I've stopped to help people clear out a bus stop or clear out a curb cut, because it's just the right thing to do because of those barriers. So that certainly community accessibility, including snow removal, is something that's a hot topic this week. But there's still so much inaccessibility in our communities. Weekly, we get stories of, children who are stuck on the sidelines at a playground because they can't get up the hill, or the playground's full of gravel, or there's no accessible features. And we're still leaving children behind, in schools, in playgrounds, etc. So those are some of the things. There's a long laundry list that continue to be barriers that we need to try and overcome.
So for workplaces in New Brunswick who want to be more accessible and friendly to persons with various disabilities, what sort of things should they have in place for both customers and staff? So if a company were to call you up and say, hey, look, can you come into my place of work, say in a typical office building or even in an industrial site, where people are allowed access, what sort of advice would you give them of things that they should be looking at?
We're very fortunate that for 3 years now, we've had a formal accessibility review service where individuals, including myself, are trained and Canadian Standards Association certified to conduct accessibility reviews. And so we have a pretty substantial tool that we can go in, and we do go in. This year we've reviewed 150 workplaces in New Brunswick to provide them a confidential report on the quick hits, the quick changes they can make for a more accessible, inclusive workplace, and some of the longer term things they may need to look at as part of renovation, reconstruction, redesign. Some of the biggest things we see are things like pathways. So are there clear, unobstructed pathways throughout your business? We often get stories, it's not even individuals with a mobility disability, where people trip on cords, they trip over boxes, they aren't able to safely navigate through the cubicles, which causes, various injuries. So that's one of the things that businesses can do, is do a walk wheel through to see, do we have adequate, clear pathways throughout our place of business? If they're a business that offers services, a lowered service counter. So individuals in a seated position, or, maybe a senior that uses a cane that can't stand for long periods, that needs to sit down for service and collect some energy, can use. Those are key things that could be changed. Ramping, thresholds that don't exceed a half an inch to get into a building. Those are really important basics to look that there's a smooth, clear pathway. Good design is no longer disability specific anymore. It's good for everyone. Think of parents using strollers. A ramp is easier to get into a building. You need an elevator to go up to the 4th floor if you have 2 kids or 1 child in a stroller. It's good for seniors, those with knee conditions, those that use mobility devices. It's just good for everyone. And so those are some of the things that businesses can look at in terms of good, safe design.
You mentioned seniors. For those that study numbers and where the seniors population is growing and so on. Of course, right now we're in that period where we're getting more and more seniors every day. What advice would you give to businesses, especially as it relates to seniors, that they may not have realized that, hey, here's a big market that we deal with, but we really maybe haven't thought about it?
Accessibility is smart investment and smart business. New Brunswick has the second highest rated disability in Canada at 35% of our New Brunswick population. We saw the highest increase in disability rate in Canada from 2017 to 2022. That's a lot of voters. That's a lot of population. Seniors, 46% of seniors in New Brunswick have some type of disability. And people often guess that it's likely memory disabilities, cognitive disabilities. It's actually mobility. And so if you're opening a business, if you're delivering services, if you're trying to hire people, including older adults, and you don't have an accessible space, you're losing money. And you're putting up barriers that could actually result in more business for your organization. So it's a significant market. I was just recently looking at a study where it's estimated that consumers with a disability in Canada are going to have buying power in the next 5 years of over $300 billion. in Canada. That's a significant market for businesses. So I think we need to start shifting our view of, barrier-free, looking at accessibility as a cost and looking at it as an investment. On that note, the Rick Hansen Institute has done a significant study with an architecture firm in BC that shows that good universal design is actually not more costly than traditional design. I always say if you can't find a planner, an architect, a contractor that can do good universal design for the same cost as traditional design, if they can't do it, the one you found, look for a new one, because there is so much modern design that doesn't scream disability. It's done well to ensure people can age in place, access services, and capitalize on that untapped market.
Why are the numbers up? You mentioned a big increase, and especially when you look at New Brunswick, why the increase or so many people with disabilities?
It's a great question, and I'm asked it all the time. And some people think I might just give a political answer, but there's several reasons. Many people guess that it's because we have the oldest population in Canada, and with age does come disability. But that's not the only reason. We have the highest multiple sclerosis rates in New Brunswick, in Canada. The rates in New Brunswick are the highest in Canada. We saw an uptick in mental health diagnosis and mental health disability rates in New Brunswick. We have high rates of neurodiversity and neurological conditions among children in New Brunswick. So there's not one factor. And we continue to see new and emerging conditions, things like this mystery illness in New Brunswick, which is, coming through our doors. Post-COVID impacting mobility is a condition that if you had asked me 10 years ago that I needed to brace myself for or make sure we could deliver services to that population, I wouldn't have believed you. So there's changing times, changing conditions, but we do have some significant high rates of disability in New Brunswick, and mobility is one of the top 3 most common disability types, next only to pain disabilities and flexibility.
From a hiring perspective, people with disabilities have always had extreme challenges in getting employed, in getting good employment. Do you see that? Is that changing any, or where are we at that way?
New Brunswick actually recently, from 2017 to 2022, experienced some positive impact in that area where we're seeing more individuals with a disability transitioning to the labor market. COVID-19, the pandemic, was actually, for all the terrible stories, actually had some good stories in it because of the changing nature of work, often remote work, and an openness to accommodation. Employers started to realize that accommodation isn't just about disability. Think of the mums that needed and dads that needed to change their schedules to be able to go and work different hours, or pick up a child at daycare, or needed to work flexible hours, or needed to work from home. It actually opened up hiring so people no longer saw accommodation as disability. I have a support plan at my office. I need a large screen. I hit 50 and I'm using glasses. I don't come in for 8:30. I come in for 9 and work to 5 because I don't like the bridge traffic. That's a support plan. So what we saw during the pandemic, a lot of our persons with a disability we work with that couldn't get physically into workplaces capitalized on the remote work opportunities. And so we actually saw an increase in people accessing the labor market.
That's kind of interesting because really we've heard so much negativity around COVID and what came out of COVID, so many challenges, negative challenges that companies are having. So kind of interesting to hear that as a positive that's come out of COVID.
It is, and I think those were 2 biggest learnings at our organization that changed the way people think about accommodations. To get workers, keep workers, to keep your business and organization going through the pandemic, we got to be creative. And so people had unique support plans. And again, this remote workforce, if you had an inaccessible workplace and had it set up that people could work remotely, it gave more hiring opportunities. I had one service participant that we work with that said his employer didn't know for 3 years that he used a wheelchair because he never could tell. He did all of his training, all of his work, was a credible employee. Didn't know for 3 years because of the remote work site, and we saw his upper body and in all those online meetings.
Yeah, and that's interesting because I know before COVID, I would suggest that the majority of employers in New Brunswick, they had people at the workplace. And if you'd asked at that time, can I work from home? The answer pretty much was always no. And certainly COVID did open up that possibility that people really can do their jobs in many, many cases from anywhere.
I agree. People had to make tough decisions. We were really fortunate at Ability New Brunswick. We're a provincial organization. We have about 26 staff, and we have a head office in the building of your organization. But the majority of our team has worked remotely for years. And so when the pandemic happened and people were being sent home, we had a decision to make. Do we lay off our staff, say we can't deliver service, not deliver on the contracts that we have to deliver service on behalf of government? Or do we get creative and find ways to do it? The remote work issue wasn't an issue, but we had to look at things such as getting personal protective equipment. We put lawn chairs in our trunks so we could meet with families in the dooryard on the front porch, to make sure everyone was protected. So, the things like the pandemic did teach New Brunswickers creativity and showed the value and the possibility and how remote work can be safe and engaging and fill labor market voids.
Now, you mentioned earlier that you get calls, of course, this time of the year with winter. Other times of the year, what kind of calls would you get from people? What kind of concerns would they have?
Lack of accessible parking is a really big one. I'll pick on St. John today because they know this well. They just had a consultation this week. The Uptown, for example, doesn't have one accessible parking spot that meets code or regulation. And what that means is there are some spots identified, but if you have an accessible van and need to deploy a ramp on the side or in the back to be able to safely get out of your vehicle and access a business, you're not able to safely do that. We've seen people injured, having to deploy these into traffic, having vehicles park alongside them so they're not able to get back into their vehicles. It poses a safety issue as well as an access issue. So we get that call. I don't mean to just pick on St. John. We get it around the province that lack of accessible parking is a major issue, and it prevents people from going to medical appointments, going out leisure, going to recreation, going out with their friends, and taking jobs. So parking is an issue. Accessible transportation. There's great programs throughout the province, like driver programs, but most of those programs don't have accessible vehicles. So if you can't transfer out of your wheelchair and need a wheel-in vehicle, you are missing medical appointments in a rural community. You can't go to post-secondary education. And so, it's a really accessible transportation is a major challenge in the province. We're really proud to be partnering right now with Dr. Trevor Hansen at the University of New Brunswick and the engineering department on an accessible transportation study so we can try and ramp up some policy changes and improve services in the province.
So if you had three wishes, three things you could change in our society, especially here in New Brunswick, to help those with various types of disabilities, what would it be? What would you like to see happen?
I really would like to see us truly eradicate this, ableist approach to where things like community design. And what I mean by that is, many people that design programs and systems have never spoken to, lived, or experienced disability. And as a result, things with a disability lens, so like a playground or a parking space or a square, often accessibility isn't considered at the forefront. And we need to stop that. I was talking to a city official this week in one of the cities, and they said, the fact that we have priority neighborhoods for snow clearance is discriminatory. I said, I agree, because the priority neighborhoods tend to be the most affluent neighborhoods. So it means people living on low incomes, people with disability are one of the two populations next only to single mothers that are the most in extreme poverty in New Brunswick. It means their neighborhoods are not cleared as quickly. It means those that live in the low income neighborhoods, and it means that they're not getting to work like they should or being able to drop their kid off at daycare or get to the bus. So we need to start designing systems and services to recognize that we have to consider the needs of people such as people with a disability, people on low incomes, if we're truly going to be inclusive. there's still, many of us, we live a life of privilege. I say I'm a woman of faith. I say it to my husband every night, how privileged we are to have a home, to be able to afford groceries, as tough as it is right now, that neither of us have a disability, because that gives us great privilege. But if I'm designing something, I want to ensure that I have all the voices at the table to consider the populations that I might not automatically think of when designing something.
It was interesting here in Fredericton, the exhibition grounds. A lot of discussion around, what were they going to do and what were they going to build around the exhibition grounds space there. And I thought at the time you really weren't hearing much conversation around possibly building, say, a seniors-oriented community or just a general community that would be a whole lot more accessible to various peoples with various kinds of disabilities. And it's really something we don't have in Fredericton. Everything's sort of mixed in together, and it's haphazard.
It is. Recently there was major bidding for a sporting event to happen, and Moncton won the bid. And the reason why a community like Fredericton couldn't win that bid is we lack accessible hotel spaces, we lack accessible restaurants, we lack accessible sport and recreation facilities, we don't have a Paralympic-sized swimming pool in the city. All of those things. So not only is there lack of access for our citizens, but we're losing out on major investment in economic tourism and accessible tourism. I think that lens is so critical. One of the things with the exhibition center, I was so happy for a few years there that they actually, were using the rink facility as a curling rink, and it actually gave Fredericton its only accessible curling rink. And we had so many people coming out to curl, and then that partnership ended, and now there's no accessible curling rink in the city. People have to drive to St. John or St. Andrews to be able to do accessible curling. And I think the junction has some access, Fredericton Junction has some access too, but if you don't have accessible transportation, how are you going to get out there? We really need to look at good design and know that, good design isn't more expensive. It just designs the same amount of space in a different way, so it's available to as many people as possible.
In a community like Fredericton that puts a lot of thought and has a lot of discussion around the environment, and that's good. Don't take anything away from that. Why aren't we doing more around the planning for the disabilities?
Sometimes it's just design afterthought. My little comment that I make, and I make it a little too often. I think I upset the architect sometimes. But if an architect or a contractor says it'll be too costly, or to develop something in an accessible way, I always say look for a new one. And it's true. There is so much. If you look throughout this country, there's so much great design to be able to integrate accessible features. I'm always told, well, Haley, we have accessible trails in the city. Have you ever seen the slope to get on the train bridge or to get up around Pickeroons? It's impossible. Someone with a mobility device, it's so difficult to be able to wheel up there. So we did a good job with the level accessible trails, but not the slopes on them. It's those type of things that get lost. So it's generally not user friendly to people with mobility devices in the city. We need to get better at thinking outside the box and looking at really good design from the onset. Retrofitting buildings and trails is so expensive. And as you know, in the economic situation we're in New Brunswick, we can't afford to be designing a building and then needing to retrofit it in a few years, all of a sudden, because we realize, wow, it's not fully accessible.
Yeah, I live up off Bishop Drive here in the city, in an area with a lot of condominiums and apartment units. And they built a beautiful new playground for our community, but it's at the top of a hill, and there's no vehicle access allowed to it. So for anyone with any kind of disabilities, you have to walk up a steep hill to get to the playground.
We see that a lot with playgrounds, and sometimes it's good intentions. I was invited to a ribbon cutting in a northern small community that had a playground with all kinds of accessible features, and I showed up and it was large rock. You couldn't wheel across it, you couldn't push a stroller, and they didn't think about it. They didn't think about the surface. Now, it's actually cheaper than the gravel to put in crusher dust. And so they had to then get the gravel hauled out and pay to put in crusher dust. But it really just is the lack of thinking with a lens about good design. So that's one of the things we're talking all the time to developers and the home and school committees developing playgrounds, and we're involved in the design of some of the new schools and new sport facilities because we want to see them designed well from the onset.
I would think there must be checklists around that topic as such. And
there's a lot of checklists and standards, and our organization can, I'm certified to actually review plans. So are many at our organization to look at plans before the design starts, to be able to give input. And we often pick up on things that are just a design architect, CAD designer error, that wasn't considered. Like I just looked at one last week where someone was putting in a parking area and all the accessible parking spots were going to be on an incline. Well, code is flat level surface. And there's a parking garage in Fredericton that the contractor, they changed the design at the last minute and all of the spots are on a slope. And we actually have had individuals park there, take their wheelchair, walker out, and it wheels out into traffic. It's a safety issue. So there's still a lot of design flaws that people just wouldn't think about. They said, it meets the width and length and the vertical signage is up. But if it's on an unlevel slope, very dangerous.
Yeah, I often comment when I go to there's a medical clinic here in Fredericton on Regent Street, and the whole parking lot, and it's a big parking lot,
on a hill,
is built on a side hill. Yes, they do have some handicapped parking spaces at the bottom, but I'm sure when you stop and think about the people that are going there for medical reasons, and probably a whole lot more people really need accessible parking that will end up near the top of the hill during a winter day when it's icy and trying to get to the bottom.
Agree. And I hear stories all the time of people that try to go to appointments because they can't find safe, level, accessible parking. They can't make their appointment. And, that's just gutting to me. We need to be able to ensure people can get to medical appointments, rehabilitation, jobs, and education.
So what are the three biggest challenges that you would say that you're going to see in the next, say, 5 years in your area?
Well, I'm actually really excited. I'm really honored that I was appointed to chair the Accessibility Advisory Board for the new accessibility legislation. The board is just starting its work to prioritize. There's 8 pillars, 8 regulatory standards that New Brunswickers want. One of them is a regulatory standard about housing, accessible housing. One is about built environment, including outdoor spaces like trails. We'll be the only province in Canada to have a regulatory standard on sport and recreation. So no more leaving kids behind on those playgrounds or in sport. So I'm really excited for the next 5 years to be able to champion that board and lead us through those regulatory standards. I'm really hoping that we'll see a greater focus on better design, inclusive housing. There's way too much aging housing stock in this province. If I keep telling developers, please stop building those split level entry homes. If someone has a stroke tomorrow and needs a home, I see it through our door every week where all of a sudden you need a lift elevator and an accessible bathroom, and that's $70,000 combined. Who has that kind of disposable income? You might get some tax relief. You basically have to be living in poverty to access provincial programs. And people are taking out second mortgages, lines of credit, expanding their mortgages. We need to develop better, housing stock that's visitable, has 0 level entry on main floors. They can have second floors, but have an accessible bathroom, possibly a den area on a main floor that can be turned into a bathroom. I see way too many people with a disability and seniors trying to sell their homes, and they can't find accessible places to live.
So as we wrap up the podcast, you've mentioned a number of times throughout this podcast that you're able to go out to workplaces, do an assessment for them. Do you want to provide folks with contact information on how they could arrange it? So if someone is listening today, whether they're in a business operation, whether they're in a retail operation, whether they're a planner, how can they contact you to have you come out and spend some time with them and help them in the design end?
Would love to. And again, we're not there to draw attention in a negative way to people. It's a confidential review report. It's very much based on regulations and best practice standards. And they can look at our website, www.abilitynb.ca. Go to the Accessible NB button. There's frequently asked questions to learn more about our service, or people can call 1-866-462-9555 to call and get a time to get an accessibility review. Right now they're free. We may have to charge in the future once our prototype and our pilot ends, but we've been overwhelmed. Small business, large business, now government departments under this accessibility legislation have to submit accessibility plans shortly, and they need reviews. The private sector is going to have to submit accessibility plans in the next few years as well. So now's the time to get the review so you can see what the quick hits are, the quick wins, and what you're going to need to look at longer term. We also have a lot of funding resources that are under Access by New Brunswick that we can link small business and nonprofit to. So it is worth the call.
So what would some of those be?
The funding sources?
Yeah.
So the Regional Development Corporation in New Brunswick has a pot of funding to help with infrastructure, mainly for nonprofits, community centers, things like that. The Federal Enabling Accessibility Fund does calls for proposals every year, sometimes for small businesses with less than 50 employees, nonprofit organizations. I know that there's several churches that we've helped apply to that funding and have been successful because they're community hubs. They deliver first aid courses in their facilities. They have seniors programs, children's programs. So those are some of there's specific sport and recreation funding sources as well that we can link people to. But I believe it's close to 100 different possible funding sources depending on the size of the business, the nature of the business that we have in our data system right now.
Well, that's great. Well, look, Haley, thank you very much for joining us on today's podcast. Keep up all the good work you're doing. I follow you on LinkedIn, and I see the various committees that you're on and the various activities that you're involved with. And it is certainly making a difference. Would we like sometimes for things to go faster? Yes. But sometimes it's one step at a time, and things are continually improving, and keep up the good work.
Very kind. I feel a little negative sometimes because, the calls and the questions that come through our door, it's a very difficult time economically for people, and there's a lot of roadblocks, but there is so many successes of this team that I get to stand beside every day. The number of people they're helping overcome roadblocks to accessibility, to financial barriers, to housing barriers is so motivating, helping them get jobs or go to post-secondary education. So it's that success story feed that's up on my computer now, or the staff chime in every day with the successes. You're right, one step at a time, and it is a community effort, and I just want to thank your organization for having us. Safety and accessibility are really closely linked, and we're all in the same business for a safer province where people can be more independent and have a better quality of life.
Well, thank you very much, and I'd like to thank Haley for joining us on today's podcast. Stay safe, folks. We will see you next week.